Hello, academic astronomy. Coming back at you for lecture number 2 of our final section of the year on extraterrestrial life. Thanks to those of you who did watch lecture number 1. In lecture 1, we talked about the pursuit of mainstream astronomy for finding extrasolar planets, how astronomers find them, and we also discussed the Drake equation, which gives us at least the ballpark scientific probability of how much life might actually be out there. And then we started to talk about the controversial but popular hypothesis called ancient aliens, which is this idea that what if a lot of the ancient writings from our ancestors wasn't really just folklore or early science fiction, but what if this was actually telling real accounts that were actually happening during their encounters with civilizations of very, very advanced technology? And so that's where we're going to pick up today with the tail end of some of the better cases from the ancient aliens hypothesis. So we're starting today. Our journey is going to take us to the South American nation of Peru. There sits a high, dry, arid plateau where there's very little food or water and nobody actually lives there. And yet, in the 1950s, when airplanes began to fly over the area, they saw, to their surprise, what looked like a grid work of modern runways spanning the entire plateau. There were also large geometrical figures, mostly animals, like hummingbirds and monkeys and scorpions and fish, carved into the ground. Curiously, one can walk right across the Nazca Plateau and not notice anything out of the ordinary. These markings were actually made by early Peruvians carving out the top layer of desert pavement and exposing lighter soil underneath. Even more curious, beside what looked like runways, there is this figure carved into the side of a hill, which the ancients call El Astronauto, which translates, of course, as the astronaut. And it appears to show a large helmet-shaped head, two very large eyes, and then its arm raised up to the sky. Over to the left, this one puzzles modern archaeologists today. This is on nearby Pulpa Flat Mountain, where, for some unexplained reason, the entire top of the mountain is leveled off like a modern runway. And archaeologists have even looked down both sides of the mountain to see if they can find where the rocks actually are. Because if the ancients did this, you would assume they did it with massive labor forces, basically picking and pulling these rocks up and then chucking them down the sides of the mountain. But they can't find any of the rocks anywhere. Somehow, the entire top of this mountain range was just leveled off flat like a runway, and nobody knows how it was actually done. So the Nazca lines are really quite a mystery. Now, you might still think, well, maybe this was just some ancient ceremonial site. And even though the ancients couldn't go into the sky, they imagined what it might be like to be a bird flying overhead and then looking down. But modern humans have actually exhibited this same tendency. So check out this picture. An author wrote a book called Cargo Cult, where he actually revisited some Pacific islands years after World War II had already ended. During the war, on some of these islands, the U.S. landed as part of their island hopping campaign as they were trying to get closer and closer to Japan to launch a direct assault with their aircraft carriers. And so they landed on a lot of islands here where there were still natives living very, very simple lives. And interestingly, to these natives, they regarded the U.S. servicemen as gods, and their airplanes were these amazing flying chariots. So an author revisits some of these islands decades after World War II ends, and he finds, to his surprise, the natives were still building model airplanes out of driftwood, and they were cutting runways in the jungle vegetation, trying to get these gods to come back. And it turns out, curiously, they weren't gods at all. They were U.S. servicemen. So some people ask, could something similar have happened here at the Nazca lines? Could this runway that you see to the left have actually been real and used by a more advanced civilization. The ancestors of ours saw that, and then they recreated these drawings on the ground to be seen from the sky to try to get these gods to actually come back. So that's the mystery of the Nazca Plateau. All right, if you wanted to pick just one single image that really highlighted the ancient aliens hypothesis, you might just pick the tomb lid of the Mayan leader Pakal the Great. Now, officially, this shows Pakal descending into the Mayan underworld, according to anthropologists and archaeologists and scholars that study the Mayan culture. But Eric von Däniken, you might remember him, had a very, very different take on this, and it's really quite thought-provoking. According to von Däniken, he believes this shows Pakal piloting the controls of a spaceship. Now, initially, it definitely sounds outlandish, but here's what von Däniken sees, and you can decide for yourself. Overall, look at the outline of the shape. It looks very similar to a Gemini capsule like what we studied in class. There's a window that Pakal can actually look through. Notice his nose is hooked up to a breathing apparatus. His arms, where in some cultures when they buried their dead, their arms are folded either across their chest or at their sides, but his hands appear to be very active and manipulating controls. His foot even appears to be on some type of throttle device. And if you look to the back of the tomb lid, you can even see flames shooting out the back. So again, according to von Däniken, it wasn't that he didn't believe in God, but he made a distinction. Whereas a lot of ancient cultures said their gods were flying around in these ships, he believed that his notion of God should not ever have to use a ship to get from place to place. So von Däniken asked, what if at least some of these accounts were actually of encounters with much more advanced civilizations who were flying things similar to what we know today? Okay, imagine finding two maps during the Dark Ages, the absolute low point of human creativity. They both showed not only a continent that would not be discovered for another 300 years, but even the land outline of that continent, which would not be known for another 450 years. Well, that is exactly what we have with the Piri Reis and Orontes Phineas maps. Both were made in the 1500s. So on the left, we have a map from a Turkish army general named Piri Reis. He claimed to have made this map off of looking off the work of previous cartographers. And so right here we have the bump of Africa. That's the technical geography term, the bump. Here we have the bump of South America. And then just a little bit down at the bottom in high detail, we have some of the coastline of Antarctica. But probably the Orontes Phineas map is even better. This comes from a French map maker, Orontes Phineas. Here you can see the southern tip of South America. Here, not only do you see the whole land outline of Antarctica, but Phineas even includes mountain ranges and river basins that are currently buried beneath miles and miles of ice. Folks, they didn't even know the land outline of Antarctica until about the 1980s, when scientists did seismic soundings down beneath the ice to see where the ice actually ended and then the land actually began. So how did these maps of a continent exist that we did not even know about for centuries more? It's truly quite a mystery. There is a chance that if you could see the Earth from outer space, you would be able to draw a fairly accurate outline of Antarctica. But again, look at our time period here. How would anybody have known what the Earth looked like from above in the 1500s? Finally, our last nice example of ancient aliens comes from Nuremberg, Germany. Is there a chance that much more advanced civilizations were actually throwing down in the skies over Earth during the Dark Ages? So here at the left, you can see a woodcut of a battle that supposedly took place over this small hamlet in 1561. According to eyewitnesses, the day dawned bright and sunny, much like many days. But then some large cigar-shaped ships appeared in the sky and floated there silently. Then, without warning, they gave birth to multiple circular ships that darted about erratically on the sky and appeared to eyewitnesses to be doing battle. They shot bright beams of light at each other, and when a ship was hit, it would either just disintegrate in the sky or fall to the ground where it disintegrated entirely. Now, skeptically, you might think to yourself, well, isn't that just convenient that the ship's entirely disintegrated so there's nothing left? But I find the descriptions of the battle to be absolutely fascinating. The battle supposedly got so intense that it even blocked out the sun itself. And think about the description of these bright beams of light. Now, today, we might certainly liken that to a laser, which the military is now using for their own applications. But check out the time period. Who in their right mind would have thought that a beam of light could inflict damage way back in 1561? Now, still, if we only had this one case, I think maybe you could say, you know what, that was just a town legend. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. But check it out. 5 years later, in the skies over Basel, Switzerland, a very similar event is recorded. Once again, notice you've got circular white and black ships covering the sky. Now, these accounts are so fantastical, I thought to myself, what does mainstream astronomy have to say about them? And the only explanation scientists can give is that these people were seeing a meteor shower, and it was a particularly intense meteor shower. But I know that can't be the case. Take a minute right now, look at both drawings, and think about what is in the drawing that proves it cannot be a meteor shower. If you said the sun, you were exactly right. No matter how intense a meteor shower, during the day, the sun is so much exponentially brighter, it would block anything like that out. So what in the world was going on in the skies here? So I hope you enjoyed this little foray into ancient aliens. It is still somewhat controversial, but that is lessening over time, and it's really gaining in popularity. A lot of people think this might actually be a possibility, but it's up for you to decide. Have we been visited in the past by ancient civilizations? Or have these accounts in modern times had some validity as well? So for the next part of our lecture today, let's talk about some actual modern accounts. Over at the right, you see a fairly famous scientist named J. Allen Hynek. Initially, the United States government had hired him as part of Project Blue Book, which was one of the last public inquiries into UFOs by the US government. And the government assumed that Hynek would be able to basically explain away every single sighting that people were having back in the 1940s and 50s. And Hynek himself began as an extreme skeptic. In fact, it was even he, much to his chagrin later in his career, who actually came up with the explanation of swamp gas to describe some UFOs. But what happened with Hynek is, the more he researched, the more he found that many of these witnesses were highly credible. They were not looking for fame or fortune. They made very high quality observations, and they were describing things that could not be explained by any natural phenomenon or conventional aircraft at the time. So Hynek actually flipped and ended up becoming a believer in UFOs. So during this time, the topic was not yet taboo, as sadly it somewhat still is today. And so mainstream scientists, led by Hynek, trying to really understand the phenomenon, came up with these levels of close encounter. Because one thing science always tries to do is objectify things to make it easier to understand and to level the playing field. So during Hynek's time, they came up with the first three levels. So if you've had a close encounter of the first kind, that's a UFO sighting. And many, many people have had them, from US presidents to Apollo astronauts to military personnel to commercial airline pilots to police officers, highly credible people have had UFO sightings. If you have had one yourself, don't feel bad about that. A lot fewer people have had a close encounter of the second kind. Now, in a type 2 encounter, there's some evidence left behind. It could be a trace on a radar screen. It could be some type of residue. A couple years ago in the Altoona Mirror, there was a front page article on people throughout Blair County who had had UFO sightings. And they mentioned a number of farmers in Tyrone that had seen UFOs over their fields, and they went out the next day to inspect them, and they found big burn marks on the ground below where they spotted the UFO. That would be a close encounter of the second kind. Something is left behind. So sometimes skeptics say, well, I believe in UFOs, but there's no evidence. So far in modern times, there are well over 2,000 close encounters of the second kind. So a lot of things do seem to be leaving some type of evidence. A third kind encounter is either of the first two types, but you actually have some sightings of some of the beings on the crafts. And we'll talk about some of the more famous encounters of those today. Now, after Hynek's time, the UFO phenomenon had become diverse enough that in modern times they added 4 more levels. And in the final lecture, we'll gloss over some of these, but we won't go too deep because some of these are a little bit creepy. A fourth kind encounter is human contact or transit with life forms. This would be the so-called alien abduction scenario. A fifth kind encounter is intentional, mutual, or consistent contact. So back in the 1950s, we had the first wave of what people called themselves experiencers, where they claimed to have multiple contacts over many, many years, sometimes throughout their lifetimes. And the extraterrestrials they reported seemed to overall be very friendly, like space brothers trying to advance our planet on the whole. Now, a sixth kind encounter is rather scary. This is an encounter that causes injury or death. And luckily, this has not happened to humans very much, though it seems like that cannot be said for cows. But we are going to talk about one case where a Kentucky Air National Guard pilot tragically lost his life while in pursuit of the UFO. And it totally changed the way the United States viewed UFO sightings. Finally, a seventh kind encounter. Is there a chance that other civilizations are not only here, but they find humans valuable enough that they are trying to merge our civilization with theirs? I'll at least show you one case that happened way back in the 1950s, and you can decide on your own. But let's start a lot more simple here. Let's start with some first kind encounters. This is where you or a group of people have actually had a UFO sighting. And what people don't realize is that sometimes these UFO events happen right over major American cities. In the 1950s, we had one called the Washington Merry-Go-Round, where UFOs actually appeared in the restricted airspace over the White House and the state capitol. But we're going to go even earlier, in fact, about 5 years before the Roswell crash, to the so-called Battle of Los Angeles. Now, you might have heard this because for any of you who were fans of the 1990s band Rage Against the Machine, they actually called one of their albums the Battle of Los Angeles. But it actually comes from this UFO sighting here. So let me set the stage for you. It's 1942. Japan has only attacked Pearl Harbor a couple months earlier. And war nerves, especially on the west coast of the United States, are at an all-time high. Fearing an imminent invasion from the Japanese, Coast Guard batteries are set up all along the west coast, keeping an eye out for the Japanese fleet and their deadly Japanese Zero. So one night over Los Angeles, a fleet of bright light appears, moving in what looks like a military formation. Immediately assuming it's the Japanese, Coast Guard batteries open fire, shooting thousands of rounds into the air, but they aren't able to bring down a single one of these crafts. What you see to the right is actually a real picture from the Battle of Los Angeles, and it appears to show what looks a lot like a modern flying saucer shape right here at the center. And then these white dots you see around it are actually artillery shells exploding in the air. And then all these lines you see are the beams of searchlights shooting up into the sky, actually looking at them. So they shot thousands of rounds into the air and they didn't bring down a single one. But the following morning, the United States knew that they had to say something about it because a handful of Americans tragically lost their lives that night, either from heart attacks due to all the shelling or from when the thousands of rounds actually came back down to the ground and hit people. So 5 years before the Roswell crash, the United States actually said this was a weather balloon that had gotten loose and had flown above the city of Los Angeles, to which the US media somewhat sarcastically replied, "How are you going to be able to beat the Axis powers of Japan and Nazi Germany if you can't even shoot down a single weather balloon?" So this one remains unexplained, and it is known as the Battle of Los Angeles. Perhaps the most famous first kind encounter of all time, and this really starts the modern wave of ufology in the United States, is the sighting of a Washington State pilot named Kenneth Arnold. This is in 1947, only about a month or so before the alleged Roswell crash. Arnold was piloting his small private airplane near Mount Rainier, Washington during the daytime. He sees a V-shaped echelon formation of silver disc-shaped reflective objects flying together near Mount Rainier. Quickly grabbing a stopwatch in his airplane, he times how long it takes the objects to move between two mountain ranges, of which Arnold knew the distance. And when he landed later, he calculated that they traveled so quickly they had to be moving at least 1,400 miles per hour. This is well in excess of Mach 2, and in 1947, the United States had nothing that could even fly to the sound barrier because it would still be a couple years before the Bell X-1 even exceeded Mach 1. Arnold landed and quickly told his story in high detail, and it made national news. Over at the left, you can see Arnold with a drawing that he later had made of the objects. And it's kind of interesting for a couple reasons. Number one, if you look at the shape of it, it's not a standard flying saucer shape. It's somewhat boomerang shaped. So some people believe that Arnold wasn't really seeing extraterrestrials, but this might have been an early version of stealth technology that the United States government was experimenting with at the time. Arnold, though, had a very interesting take. He did believe these were extraterrestrial craft, but he did not think there were actually little tiny green men inside piloting them. He thought that the craft itself was basically a living entity from another solar system. And this is also where we actually get the phrase flying saucer, as a newspaper reporter whose name has been lost to history basically said that Arnold described their movements like saucers skipping on water. So that's actually where the phrase flying saucer is coined. Okay, let's talk about some second kind encounters. A second kind encounter is a sighting of a UFO, but there's some evidence left behind. So first we're going to talk about crop circles. Now, probably initially, when I mention crop circles, you kind of snicker a little bit. And you have a view of teenagers, somewhat like yourself, sneaking out to a farmer's field late at night, maybe tipping over one or two unsuspecting cows and tramping down a shape in some of his wheat and then sneaking out before the sun comes back up. And there certainly have been some pranks, but there's also some very compelling things about crop circles that most people do not realize. For starters, this is not just a modern phenomenon. It at least dates back as early as 1678. Over here at the right, we have the front page of a British newspaper at the time. And these odd shapes were attributed to mowing devils. So if you look closely here, you can see a depiction of the devil right there. And he has a sickle shape. But if you look at the overall shape that's made in the crops, you can see it looks very similar to a crop circle today. Now, back in the early 80s, the media was very interested in the phenomenon until two elderly British gentlemen named Dan and Dave came forward. Dan and Dave claimed that they came up with the idea over a couple pints at a pub, and they took the media out to a field in England, and they showed how, using 2x4s with holes drilled at the end, and then a thick piece of rope run through the board with knots tied underneath, they could actually hold the rope taut and push it against their foot, and they could walk around in a circle pressing on the board, and it would actually make a nice looking little circle. So the media's filming this the entire time. And then as far as the mainstream was concerned, all crop circles were pranks made by Dan and Dave. But couple things to consider. Thousands of them are now happening all around the world. Almost every major country on earth has reported crop circles for many years. And Dan and Dave are long since gone. So you might think, well, even though they've died, these are just the disciples of Dan and Dave continuing this. But crop circles don't just appear at night. They often appear right in the middle of the day in a matter of minutes. Farmer drives through his field, all is well. He or she comes back through a couple minutes later, boom, suddenly huge crop circle on the ground. Number three, if these are pranksters, they are brilliant ones. They often display fractal mathematics. So take a look at this crop circle over here. This was found in a farm field in England. Seems like some of the best ones are still found in England today. And just to give you an idea of scale here, were this here in America, it could cover about 6 football fields. Even though it's called a circle, it is comprised of over 300 individual circles, and it's perfectly symmetrical. How could pranksters ever do that from the ground? This is textbook fractal mathematics. Fractals basically means you take the same shape or pattern and you repeat it over and over and over again at bigger and bigger or smaller and smaller increments. So that is one example. Some crop circles have actually displayed mathematical theorems, which to that point were not even discovered yet. Number 4, if you and some friends went out to a field just to knock some wheat over, you could probably tramp it down, but you would break a lot of the stalks of wheat in the process. In a quote-unquote real crop circle, the stalks of wheat or grain are never broken. They actually flop over at their nodal points and they continue to grow sideways. I once read a book where a team of scientists tried to recreate this in a lab, and the only way they could do it is by actually microwaving some stalks of grain in a microwave. And when they did this, the tiny amount of water in the stalk of grain would actually boil and puff up, and then the whole stalk of grain would flop over sideways. How in the world could you get microwaves out to a large field like this? Further, if you look up close at crop circles, they aren't just flattened over. Some of the quote-unquote real ones actually show where the stalks are interwoven like a bushel basket. How would pranksters ever actually have time to do that? Now, you might think to yourself, well, man, doesn't this end up affecting the farmer's field? Not only does it not hurt the grain, but the following year, there are actually ghost images in the same place where the crop circle was, because what's ever planted there the following year grows even more rapidly than the surrounding area. Okay, on to number 5. Folks who want to take their cell phones or cameras inside a crop circle to get a really good look at them and photograph them often walk away disappointed. There seems to be an electrically charged field around the crop circles, and often it will fry circuitry of electronic devices. Farm animals nearby will often react wildly, both before the crop circle is made and then after it's laid down on the ground. How would that ever happen if it was just pranksters? One time, Mythbusters on the History Channel actually tried to replicate a crop circle. And one of the things that they could never actually get right is how in a real crop circle, the grains are actually magnetized. You can hold a magnet up to them and they'll stick right to the magnet. Recent circles have gotten even more complex. So 2 examples, both found in England. Over here to the right, This was found at the Chilbotton Radio Telescope in England, and some believe it's actually an answer to the message that radio pioneers Carl Sagan and Frank Drake beamed out to the Hercules globular cluster way back in the 1970s. If you want to look up that message, this one looks very similar, but instead of a human being pictured here, it appears to be a smaller, large-headed extraterrestrial. The DNA sequence that they show for humans has been slightly altered, as has been the solar system shown at the being's feet. So some believe this was a genuine attempt for another civilization to answer back. Now, over here at the left, we have a very controversial crop circle. Even some people who believe in the reality of crop circles believe this one is a hoax. It appears to show an extraterrestrial holding a disc in its hand and 3 UFOs in the background. Some people have called this a hoax because notice the edges aren't crisp and clear like some of the more classic crop circles. But what's really fascinating about this one, it was actually created like lines on a television screen. It wasn't made like one big image, but rather there are at least 65 individual lines pressed down in the crops, and together they make this bigger image. In the being's hand is holding a disc that just happens to have a very common programming language called ASCII. ASCII is a type of computer programming. So again, if these are pranks, people are to the point where they're not entirely sure how they're being done. And just to make sure we relate it to a second kind encounter, eyewitnesses often see UFOs or balls of light hovering above the fields. The UFOs leave, and then the crop circle is on the ground. So if you find any of this interesting, do your own research, because all I know for sure is there's a lot more to them than just teenage pranksters sneaking out into a field and tramping some grains down. Okay, most people have heard of Roswell. What a lot of people don't know is we have a fairly famous UFO crash right here in Pennsylvania. This was 1965. This was called the Kecksburg UFO crash. And I'm calling this a second kind encounter because officially beings inside the ship have never been reported, whatever the ship actually was. So here's the story. Throughout the Midwest U.S. on this day in December 1965, eyewitnesses reported what looked like a UFO zigzagging across the sky and shooting a mess of bright green sparks and smoke out of it. Then that night, in a tiny little hamlet outside of Pittsburgh called Kecksburg, eyewitnesses described seeing this thing come to the ground and crash in a wooded thicket outside of town. Locals went immediately to investigate. In fact, the local fire company was even called in. And eyewitnesses described that this is what they actually saw. It was a small acorn-shaped ship, only probably big enough for one full-size man inside. And it appeared to have a raised rim around the bottom where there was some hieroglyphic writing. But then, according to eyewitnesses, the military quickly intervened and they pushed all the locals out and they cordoned off the entire woods. They then brought in a flatbed truck, and a couple hours later, eyewitnesses saw the truck leaving the thicket, but now there was something on the back of it about the size of this ship that was covered with a big tarp. Officially, according to the military, nothing ever actually crashed in the woods. So this one makes for a really interesting case. Some people feel that it wasn't alien at all. Some believe that a Soviet Venera space probe actually malfunctioned on its way through the atmosphere on its way to Venus, and it actually crashed here in Pennsylvania. To cover, the Soviets quickly rebranded it a Cosmos probe, which was a much more simple communications satellite instead of one of their larger Venus probes. Still, others believe it wasn't alien, but this was actually an extension of some research the Nazis were doing at the end of World War II. This was Die Glock, the supposed Nazi bell, which was either a prototype of some type of anti-gravity ship, or some even believe the Nazis were trying to build a time machine. After World War II, through Operation Paperclip, the United States brought a number of those rocket scientists, like Wernher von Braun, here to the United States. So some believe the Kecksburg acorn was actually an attempted extension of that technology, which was still not working properly, yet others believe this was a genuine crash of an extraterrestrial ship. So check that one out if you're interested. It happened pretty close to home. For those of us watching from Pennsylvania, that was the Kecksburg, PA UFO crash. Okay, the last ones we're going to talk about before we get done with this lecture now are third kind encounters. A third kind encounter is either the first two types, but you allegedly see some pilots of the ship. So our first UFO crash in the United States isn't actually Roswell. It isn't Kecksburg. It happens in a little village called Aurora, Texas, back in 1897. At this time, there was the first wave of great airship sightings all across the western United States. And at this time, the only thing that should have been up in the air, other than birds, would have been hot air balloons, as dirigibles or blimps were only now coming into existence. And so in one tiny town, they had a story in their newspaper where one of these airships came to the ground. It appeared to be smoking and malfunctioning. It hit into a windmill owned by a Judge Proctor, and it exploded. The town then had a burial, a Christian burial for the pilot, who was an inhabitant not of this world. And they buried the being in the local cemetery, where for many, many decades, it was marked by this sandstone tombstone, which appears to have a carving of the ship on it. Well, that all changed when the excellent writer and researcher, the late Jim Mars, visited Aurora, Texas. He and some other reporters went to this cemetery with a metal detector and ran it over the grave and had hits at 3 different locations. But at that point, a vigilante group and the local sheriff chased them off and told them they were no longer permitted in the cemetery. When they went back a few weeks later, the tombstone was now gone, and there were 3 small boreholes in the ground. They ran the metal detector back over the grave, and they got nothing at all. Now, just the act of that tombstone being removed was a pretty big deal, because now that grass has grown over the area, it's really difficult to tell exactly where the gravesite was. The best people can do is look at old pictures like this and try to triangulate it based on where they see other trees. Curiously, to this day, at the site of the crash, no grass will grow, and the water in the well is still radioactive and cannot be drank. So was this a genuine UFO crash? That's Aurora, Texas, 1897. So, of course, the last one we're going to talk about today is the granddaddy of them all, Roswell, New Mexico. Some people believe if events worked themselves out differently in that early July of 1947, we would be living in a very, very different world today. What we know for sure is that something crashed in Roswell, at least one thing, maybe even 2 things. What we don't know is the exact identity of what that object was. What might surprise you, and it surprises a lot of people, is the government originally admitted they had recovered a flying disc. They admitted it. Check out the headline here from the Roswell Daily Record. Roswell Army Airfield, because this is prior to the Air Force coming into existence, captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. It wasn't until later that day that the story was changed to a flying saucer. Phone calls were cut dead at the switchboard, and all the media in the area was herded into the local Roswell TV radio station. And they were told that if they continued to report the rumor, they would lose their credentials and likely be arrested. So there are multiple accounts. At one site, a rancher named Mac Brazel found a huge field of scattered debris. And at a separate site, some people claim to have actually found the craft with at least 2 to 3 bodies of extraterrestrial pilots. Some feel that there was either a collision the night before between 2 crafts in a lightning storm. Others believe it was just one craft that actually hit the ground on Mac Brazel's ranch and then skipped and then landed farther away. So over time, this story has changed multiple times. Even the government itself has shifted its story 3 to 4 times about what actually crashed at Roswell. Officially now the story is that it was a Project Mogul balloon, which was used to monitor nuclear blasts from the Soviet Union. But it seems like Project Mogul didn't even start until the early 1950s. At one point, the government said they weren't actually alien bodies, but they were crash test dummies. The problem there is, again, the military did not use crash test dummies in this capacity until the early 1950s. So a lot of people think this was a big deal at the time, but it was actually covered up so well, people didn't even actually find out about the Roswell crash until the late 70s, when the late nuclear physicist turned UFO researcher named Stanton Friedman began to research it. I was lucky enough on one occasion to actually lecture at a conference with Friedman, and he was a highly credible man and a very, very detailed researcher. So some people believe that this might be the closest we've come as regular people to finding that we're not alone in the universe. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for sticking with me through this lecture. So now I'm going to ask you your 10 multiple choice questions. You can pause this video at any time and switch back and forth between YouTube and Google Classroom. This will be assignment number 2. These are questions 11 through 20. Good luck. Question 11. A high arid plateau in this South American country features structures that can only be seen from the air, and it's at the top of a mountain, chopped flat like a modern runway. Question number 11. Go ahead and pause the video and answer the question. Number 12. This tomb lid is the perfect example of a clash of mindsets. Mainstream archaeologists see a ruler descending into the Mayan underworld, while ancient aliens followers see him piloting the controls of a spacecraft. Number 12. Number 13. This continent would not be discovered for another 3 centuries, yet it was depicted on both the Orontes Phineas and Piri Reis maps way back in the 1500s. Number 13. Number 14. In an effort to objectify the study of UFO phenomena, scientists led by J. Allen Hynek created levels of blank blanks, which have been increased to 7 levels in recent years. Number 14. Number 15. The first kind encountered by this well-respected pilot ushered in the modern era of ufology in the United States. Number 15. Number 16. Usually considered modern hoaxes, these second-kind phenomena have been present since the late 1600s and often exemplify great symmetry and high-end fractal mathematics. Number 16. Number 17. Considered the Roswell of Pennsylvania. An acorn-shaped ship allegedly crashed outside of this tiny village east of Pittsburgh in 1965. Question 17. Number 18, true or false? The government originally admitted that a flying disc crashed outside of Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. True or false? Number 18. Number 19. It was not until later that day that the cover story of a blank blank was floated, and the government story has since changed 3 to 4 times in the decades which followed. Number 19. And finally, number 20. These alleged crashes of UFOs, while witnessing the craft's pilots, would all be considered close encounters of the blank kind. Question number 20. All right, that's just going to about do it for our Zoom today. Sorry that these lectures take a little bit longer, but I think some of these cases are so fascinating, and I just want to do my best to just kind of put these things out there for you, and then you reach your own conclusions on your own, because that's what real science is all about. Make sure if you haven't done so, you do visit Google Classroom and you answer questions 11 through 20, and we'll just have one more lecture to go on the search for extraterrestrial life. Mr. Krug, signing out. Peace.